Today is November 4th, 2016. My name is Martin Frank, and I'm here at the Penn State College of Medicine in Hershey to interview a friend, Leonard Jim Jefferson. Jim has been an APS member since 1970. He is a past APS president and recently was elected as an APS fellow in 2015. Jim's research contributions has been at the forefront of providing an understanding of the signaling and molecular mechanisms through which insulin and nutrients maintain muscle mass and thus prevent the consequence of diabetes. Jim, welcome to the Society's Living History program, and thank you for agreeing to be interviewed for this series. Jim, your CV indicates that you were born in Maysville, Kentucky. Can you tell us a little bit about your family upbringing in northeastern Kentucky and how you became interested in science?
My father and mother were families of the Great Depression, and my father was a tenant farmer, and I had very little education. So I was born just outside of Maysville. My earliest memories was that my father had moved from there to being a tenant farmer. I remember milking cows and helping plant tobacco.
I knew where you were born, Jim, but I hadn't realized that you had grown up on a farm.
Yeah, it was.
Jim or Chuck told me, which explained to me why you have this god-awful tractor at your house and why you like going out and mowing the lawn.
Well, I was milking cows by hand when I was probably 5 years old, and when I reflect back on it, it's hard to imagine, starting where my dad was and being where I am. It's just
what level of education did your dad have?
Very little formal education, maybe 5th, 6th grade or something. He was, growing up in the Depression. He was basically a day laborer and earning, 75 cents a week or something.
Right.
Some incredibly awful number. And he didn't get married till he was 32, and that was coming out of the Depression. And so I was born just after he had come through all that. And by the time I graduated high school, he had managed to move from being a tenant farmer to owning a farm, and then another farm, and then the farm that is still the family farm was purchased when I was in high school. And growing up, it was my mother that really inspired education. She was a high school graduate, and so she pushed to make sure I did my studies, even though I was devoting a lot of time to the farm. My father had a health problem when I was about 12 or 13, and at that time I had to take over the farm completely. And I would rush home and get on the tractor and do whatever needed to be done. And even in college, I was coming back to
help
harvest,
and
the planting. And I was driving big trucks by the time I was 13 or something.
But you couldn't get your driver's license?
No. So I was in agriculture, and I studied that in high school. My high school was a small class of 40 students. I think what inspired me to sort of start down the career path I did was I had a chemistry teacher in high school, and I really loved that subject. And so I thought about going to college. Nobody in my family had gone to college. My father was against it. He wanted me to stay and run the farm. I finally persuaded him that I would go to a nearby school, Eastern Kentucky University, and study chemistry, and come back and work at a local chemical company and still run the farm. So we kind of fought the whole way to the campus, so once I was in college, I had an organic chemistry teacher who probably was the other next influence in my life. It was elementary chemistry, actually, the first year, and he asked this question, why does grass grow greener under locust trees? And with my agricultural background, I'm sitting in the back of the room and I raise my hand, and so it's a legume. And so from that moment on, I sort of became his pet student, I guess. And he was a frustrated person because he had wanted to go to medical school and had not been able to. And so he kind of identified students that he tried to direct toward medical school. So from that point on, my intent was to go to medical school, and in fact, in my third year of college, I applied to a number of schools, including the University of Chicago, and was accepted. But I had a romantic interest at that time who was also going to go to medical school, but she was a year behind me, and so I stayed for my senior year. We applied to a number of medical schools, and we had actually accepted a place at Bowman Gray, which is now Winston-Salem University. And then the romantic contact broke up around Christmas of my senior year, and I'm sitting in my room, and I have this application to Vanderbilt that I had not submitted, so I ended up sending it in, and that was the key point in my career development, I guess, because I was interviewed. One of my interviewers was Rollo Park, and he convinced me to come to Vanderbilt in an MD PhD program. So that really fit me because I didn't have the financial resources. So I ended up going there, did 2 years of medical school, and then did the PhD part, and I had such a passion for research that I just did not go back and do the last 2 years of med school. So that's sort of how I got to being a local naive farm boy is what I tell my wife, but to being at Vanderbilt.
Tell us a little bit about the research you did at Vanderbilt, as well as Rollo Park, who was really a stellar individual in your field of research.
Yeah, Rollo was an unbelievable individual. He had graduated medical school at, he went to undergraduate at Harvard and graduated medical school at Hopkins. His dad was chairman of pediatrics at Hopkins for many years. He had gone from sort of his military commitment to Washington University to work in the Corey lab, and as you probably know, the Coreys were Nobel Prize winners, and 5 other people who came through their lab were Nobel Prize winners. So Rollo came from that environment. When he was 32 years old, he was actually offered a chair at Vanderbilt, and so he became essentially straight from postdoc to being a chair. So he was a clear influence in my life. Not only did he identify me to give me the opportunity to come there, but he was an influence in many ways. The research at Vanderbilt at the time was, the whole focus was understanding how insulin controls blood glucose. So the interest was in diabetes, and it was focused on, Rollo's early work was, his contribution was defining how insulin actually stimulates the uptake of glucose by cells, and at that time that wasn't known. It was known that if you gave insulin, blood glucose went down, but it didn't. Nobody knew how it happened. So my work was focused on how does insulin prevent glucose production by the liver. And so at that, Rollo had just recruited Earl Sutherland to Vanderbilt, and Earl had recently at that time won a Nobel Prize for his discovery of cyclic AMP. So my work then was able to demonstrate that the action of insulin on glucose production by the liver was mediated by a reduction in the content of cyclic AMP, or the production of cyclic AMP in the liver. It's
very interesting, I think, for those of you who are watching this video. I would encourage you to go to our website and watch the interview that Jim has done with Rollo Park to learn a little bit more about his career. In 1967, shortly after you received your PhD, you were recruited to the department here at Penn State Hershey by Howard Morgan, who was the chair. Tell us a little bit about what it was like to be one of the 5 founding members of the department here.
Yeah, let me go back and fill in a little bit of the time gap there. One of the tributes of Rollo Park was he encouraged students to have experiences at different places. And I mean, for an example, he had sent me to learn the instant radio immunoassay from the Burson-Yalow lab. And,
Right.
and they
Also,
had just...
Also Nobel laureate.
Well, one of them was a Nobel laureate, the other one died before he, Burson died before he got it. But I think I owe a lot of my career success to the things that happened at Vanderbilt at that time. So, he sent me to places like that. And so I was beginning to develop a network of people. And one of the, Don Steiner was another person that came through at that time that I became friends with, and he was also a great influence in my life. But one of the people that came through Vanderbilt while I was still a student was Asher Corner. And Asher was, at that time, was at Cambridge University in England. And it seemed like a wonderful opportunity because Rollo was encouraging me to get experience outside the country.
Okay.
And so I was able to arrange a postdoc at Cambridge with Asher Corner. Wonderful experience. There were, at that time, there were 12 graduate students in his lab. I was the only postdoc. I was sort of a rarity. They didn't know much about postdocs at that time. And I could go down the whole list of 12 graduate students. All of them have become well-known scientists. Tim Hunt won the Nobel Prize, which is probably the most notable accomplishment, but many of them excelled in science. So that was in between the Vanderbilt experience and coming to here at Hershey. While I was in England, Rollo had just come through Hershey, accepted the chair, and come to England to visit me. And so while he was there, he offered me a position here on the faculty. So I sort of accepted it sight unseen. I came back to this country February '67, and I came through Hershey, and it was cold. The building was just beginning to be constructed, and so I didn't even have a place to go at that point, and I went back to Vanderbilt and spent until July. I went to Vanderbilt and worked again as a postdoc. So I came here in '67. It was still, the building was still under construction. My office was in the farmhouse across the street, which is now the Cocoa Beanery. Okay. So there were 5 of us. Howard had brought myself, Bob Neely, or it was James Robert Neely, but people know him as Jim or Bob. And Warren Davis, so it was Howard, Warren Davis, Bob, and myself from Vanderbilt. And then he brought Glenn Mortimer here from the NIH. And so those were the 5 original faculty members in the department.
You said Rollo offered you the job. So was he coming here as...
No, I must have misspoke. It was Howard. Howard
Okay.
offered me the job on his visit to Cambridge
Okay.
just after he had accepted the chair here.
Right. What was it like starting a new department and the challenges of being part of really a new medical school, right?
In some ways it was fun, exciting. I mean, it was certainly challenging. initial experience in teaching was teaching respiratory physiology, which I probably knew less about than the graduate students or the medical students
You
coming in.
just had to stay one page ahead of them.
Right, so I stayed one page ahead. It was a small class. The first class was only 40 students, so it was more intimate. I mean, everybody knew everybody. The faculty hung out with the students at a local bar, and so it was fun and exciting. But on the other hand, it was also challenging in terms of getting a research program accomplished or initiated and getting it started. So, but Howard was actually determined enough that he was doing experiments. Well, some people say he was actually doing experiments in the moving van on the way from Nashville to Hershey, but he actually set up to do experiments in the farmhouse that we all were located in initially. So, but I came across campus in the spring of '68, and my initial lab was one of the teaching labs, and then by late '68, I had my own laboratory at that point. So.
I'm just curious, what was your startup package?
Well, my salary was $10,000, and there was no startup package.
Really?
No.
Yeah, I thought it was always that way. Jamie rose rapidly through the ranks here in the department and replaced Howard as department chair in 1988. What lessons did you learn from Howard, observing him and his leadership role that has enabled you to serve as chair of the department for 26 years? You recently stepped down.
Right. Well, I guess one of the things I remember most about Howard is he had a tremendous ability to see directly through to the core of a problem. So all the smoke and mirrors and hidden agendas and so on made no difference. I mean, he could just see right to what the key issue was and deal with that. And so that was an important lesson, particularly in administration, because you deal with a lot of smoke and mirrors, I might say. And the other thing, I mean, he was a no-nonsense person who was very driven, and I think probably he contributed as much to my science, direction of my science as my learning administrative skills from him. But one of the reasons I had gone to Cambridge was I was inspired by pictures, even though I was studying glucose metabolism at Vanderbilt, I was inspired by pictures of diabetic children taken before and after the discovery of insulin in 1921. And if you see these pictures, the diabetic children had lost all their muscle mass. And in fact, the definition of diabetes originally was melting down of the flesh into urine. So one of the driving points that for choosing Cambridge as a place for postdoc was they were just beginning to work on messenger RNA and protein synthesis. And obviously protein synthesis was very important in maintaining muscle mass. And Howard had never worked on protein synthesis, but the summer before moving here, he took, as far as I know, his only vacation and went up to the Northeast and rented a cabin and got every paper he could find on protein synthesis. And so when I came, and I was coming back from a lab that was doing pioneering work in messenger RNA translation, I misspoke again, Howard was just beginning to try to think about turning toward protein synthesis for his own work. And so we actually did some collaborative work early on, and it had a great influence. I mean, in terms of my direction and his direction at that time. Administratively, I guess one of the things was don't ever take no for an answer. I mean, if you get no, just wait and come back another day. And
That's with your faculty or with the administration?
with the faculty in particular,
Okay.
at faculty meetings, you let something get talked out. If it's not going to go through, you visit it at another time. So.
Okay. What have been the greatest challenges you faced as a chair? And I know you were here with the founding, there were 5 members. I don't know how large the department was when you took over. I don't know how the size.
Well, the department had grown to probably 10 or 11 faculty when Howard left, but he took, there were 8 left. He took 3, 2 counting himself, there were 3. And so there were 8 faculty left when I became chair. We grew to 21 at our peak. The early years of being chair was fun because, first of all, I was hired by Dean Mac Everts, a surgeon from Rochester, and we had a great working relationship, Mac Everts and myself, and he provided, the resources and the support to make being chair fun, and we were able to grow the department. We became the best funded department in the whole university in terms of NIH funding. I guess the fun part began to change about 2000 when there was a change of deans, and at that time there was also, instead of departments being autonomous and doing their own teaching and having their own graduate student program and so on, there was a trend nationally and here to centralize things, and so essentially you went from being a part of the leadership to being what I would call a manager. And so I didn't enjoy being a manager so much. It was much more fun when I was allowed to be inspirational and innovative in terms of moving forward. And so the last few years were not as much fun, I guess. But and again, I think that's not uncommon when you have a change of deans and a change in the direction of the institution.
Right, and unfortunately it's typical of what's happening across the academic
it's right.
Like Howard, you believe, faculty member, it's important to provide service both to the your academic societies and to the university. Can you tell us a bit about some of your experiences and why service is an important component of an academic career?
Yeah, I guess my view is that you're a part of a community, whether it's the college or the university or your professional society. So I felt very strongly that I needed to be committed to the communities that I was a part of and try to provide support and involvement. And if you don't do that, then those communities are not going to thrive. I mean, if people in general don't do that, they're not going to thrive. And so yes, I was very involved in obviously the APS, but also the American Diabetes Association and the Juvenile Diabetes Foundation. The latter two, I was involved early enough that with my experience at NIH review mechanisms, I was able to actually help influence the direction of the research programs of those two organizations. Again, I felt it as a commitment to provide service, and it also provides the opportunity to network, and networking is probably the most important thing you need to do to be successful as a scientist.
Jim, you were the 68th president of the APS. Your former chair, Howard Morgan, was our 58th president of the society. You served as president after Brian Dooling from Charlottesville and Jim Schaefer from Birmingham, Alabama. Tell Tell us a little bit about your tenure as president and on council and working with the folks around the council table.
Well, one of the most pleasant thoughts is the idea of working with Brian Dooling, because he was a charming, exceptional individual, and so I had 3 years of working with Brian, first as president-elect when Brian was president, and then when I was president, and then and Brian was past president. So so that was fun. What I remember about that time is I came in as president at a time when research funding had been relatively flat, which is sort of like it has been in recent years. So from '87 till when I became president, the NIH funding, and at that time, the FASAB societies, including the APS, had developed a consensus report to challenge Congress basically to increase NIH funding. So I guess one of the things that stands out then is that my time there, not that I necessarily had any influence, but it was the beginning of a number of really important changes that continued. So that was sort of the beginning of the doubling period, which didn't get really ingrained in Congress for a couple more years. But and I remember going with you to John Porter, the
Congressman Porter from Illinois, who was chair of the House Subcommittee on Appropriations.
Yeah, I remember that experience very well. I think one of the things to bring out is how important the APS staff is, and you in particular, to function of the APS. Presidents kind of come and go, and it's you guys that deserve all the credit for making things happen. So that was, it was a great pleasure working with you at that time.
Same here. Even if you beat me on the golf.
So the other change that was beginning at that time, as you well know, is the publication situation. And so we were facing just the beginning of what was the electronic publication that was starting at that time.
Right.
The APS has sort of been a leader in that, and I know a lot of discussions were taking place the year I was president as to how to deal with the changing environment in terms of electronic publications. Publications for APS had been very successful, and they were threatened by these changes, and so my hat's off to you and subsequent presidents to survive the threat that came with electronic publication. I think one of the other things that jumps out in my mind that we accomplished that year, which is probably important in terms of programs that the APS supports, is there was a decision made at that time by council to basically treat the reserve fund from the publications as an endowment, and then to spend, I think, 5% was 4% of that toward programs that the APS wanted to provide for its membership. So that was an important accomplishment, I think.
I will agree, because it allowed us to create many more programs to give back some of the reserves to the members. It was quite successful.
And the other thing that stands out is we were able to convince council that Marty's ought to be paid like he deserves. So.
Well, in that regard, thank you very much. I appreciate that. While service is important, as you suggested, for a faculty member within a university or an association world, clearly the coin of the realm today is research. Okay, you need to bring research dollars to an academic medical center. You've been very successful. You have one grant that is in its 44th year, another in the 46th, and last night you told me you got a dismal score on a grant of a 1, which I said was really disappointing. I thought you could do at least much better than that. Yeah. But tell the listeners a little bit more about your research area, how it developed. You've mentioned a number of people who were influential, but I think there's a lot more to be said.
Well, there are two things that jump out in my mind. I mentioned networking earlier, and clearly that networking and people, being aware of your training and where you've been and what you've accomplished in your training is always important in terms of getting the initial funding. What was, excuse me, my driving question was what I brought up earlier is how do you prevent this, or how does insulin work to prevent this muscle wasting? And so I was, again, I think Howard Morgan was influential in helping me learn how to do grant applications appropriately or the right way, and so the thing that has driven my research is the big question, and what I see so much of these days with students, and it's frustrating, is because they're focused, what I call down in the weeds. They're missing the big picture, and research. Medical research was originally driven by questions that came out of the clinic, and so everybody in the years when I began training were really focused on problems that were clearly medically relevant. And then we went through what I call a gene bashing era, where we trained a bunch of tech junkies that we lost a generation, I think, because they learned how to sequence DNA. I think, in my view, the important thing when you're thinking about research is, I've heard the expression, ask big, audacious questions, but you should definitely have the thing that should drive your research is the question and not the technology. And so that's been my focus. The question I'm asking is the same one I started out asking. And so, and I've adapted or adopted technology as it has become available to help answer that question, which sort of moves you incrementally forward. And so that's, in terms of success, I think that's really key. Is and obviously you have to be productive, but I think being focused on what's important and being not afraid to fail are two things, because right now, among the young trainees, there's a dispirited nature because they hear about the challenge of getting grants, and they're not sure they want to pursue a career in science, and you have to be not afraid to fail and to go forward anyway. So.
Well, I will talk a little bit about that and your thoughts about young aspiring scientists. But clearly, at least based on my expectation, when you first came into science, some of the first meetings that you went to were probably in Atlantic City at
yes.
the FASA meeting. Reflecting back on those days, how do you think scientific meetings have changed? I think a lot of our listeners won't remember the good old days.
The good old days. Well, my first FASAB meeting was in Atlantic City in probably 1962, probably. I was a second-year graduate student, or I was I was second year in the MD PhD program, and it was the summer of that year that I went. Atlantic. We drove from Nashville to Atlantic City, the boardwalk, the ocean. I'd never seen the ocean before that, so it was different in not only location and environment, but the size. I mean, the other difference I remember is that the scientific community was smaller, and the big names in the field were readily available and accessible, as opposed to now where the meetings are so big and sometimes the big names are not to be seen at the...
They helicopter in, give their talk, and leave.
Correct, yes.
Yeah. Well, I think the other difference is almost everything was platform sessions.
Yes, that's a big difference, yes.
At those early meetings.
That was all platform.
Now they're almost all poster sessions, in part because of the growth of the community.
That's exactly right. And I never really adapted well to posters. I never found it to be a efficient learning process. So.
During your career, you've mentored a number of graduate students and postdocs, and obviously you mentor new faculty as they come in. As such, what advice would you give to a student starting out today, and how would you help them to fulfill their aspirations?
Well, the thing I look for most in a student is to try to help them find out what their passion is. I mean, if you don't have a passion to do something, you're not likely to succeed at it. And so, and that's particularly true in science. I mean, you have to really love it and be excited by it and think about it when you're showering in the morning and the whole thing. So passion is key. I think one of the things that some of my contemporaries were guilty of is wanting students to be a clone of themselves, and my approach has always been to try to help students achieve what they really have the potential to do. And in addition to the passion, you need, don't make it difficult for a student if they want to go from a research lab to a small liberal arts college to teach. I mean, so I've really promoted the idea that students should find what they love to do and then reach their full potential in doing that. Same way I treated office staff or other young faculty members. My graduates have gone, one of my ex-students is a patent attorney in Chicago, extremely successful. And so you don't have to become a clone of your of your advisor or mentor.
Well, I think it's one of the challenges because many faculty, not yourself, aren't prepared to allow their students to explore options. As we all know, a PhD gives you the critical thinking skills and problem-solving ability to do anything you want to do.
Exactly.
So,
yeah.
We've touched on a number of aspects of your career, Jim, and at least I've finished with the questions I had in mind, but are there things that you would like to share with our listeners about your career that I may not have asked you about?
Well, I appreciate doing this, Marty, even though I've delayed doing it for about 3 years. I think, these are, I've come to realize these are very important things to do to sort of preserve the history of the society. I think if members are watching this, they need to understand how important it is to be involved with the APS and to contribute, because it is your community, basically. And so, and it's fun.
It wasn't too terrible of an interview for you. Jim, thanks for being part of the Society's Living History program. On my own behalf, on behalf of the Society, I wanted to thank you for sitting for this interview. I want to thank you for your many years of service to the Society and hopefully many more years of interactions as we go forward. Thank you.
Well, thank you for being here, Marty, and I really enjoyed it.